All right, all right. I am here, and we will continue on the endless quest to respond to every single YouTube video on metaethics. But this time, we've got more Twitter and a blog post from Mike Humer. And so Mike Humer is, well, I did a discussion with him back in October, but he's also one of the most prominent contemporary moral realists, and he's a proponent of non-naturalist moral realism. The view he defends, he calls ethical intuitionism, and he has a book by that name, Ethical Intuitionism. So go check the book out. It is good to study the opposing side. I have a couple books over there. I picked up Essays on Moral Realism by Sarah McCord, and what's the other one I got? Moral Realism and the Foundations of Ethics. So I picked those up. I haven't read them, so I think that's Brink. So I'm gonna have to read those. But yeah, so we're gonna cover that. But I want to get into the a couple tweets that I saw and talk about those. So maybe there won't be a video to review, I guess. All right. So Sully, I guess you're first for 1,000 land salute, harmonica for 500, and then real time for 250. And real time, it's ironic your name is real time, and then you were slow and you have bad internet connection. All right, everybody. Okay, so let's see which ones I want to show. Let's start with this one. So this is an alleged proof of moral realism. So take a look at this proof here. Simple proof of moral realism. One, so premise one, torturing babies for fun is wrong, regardless of what anyone thinks. Therefore, conclusion, moral realism is true. Now, this is not a great argument by any means. I mean, one, it's an enthymeme, so we don't even get any sort of clear syllogism. You know, we're not getting modus ponens or modus tollens or something like that. That doesn't, I wouldn't say that, this is an invalid argument because the other premise is implied, and it would be pretty easy to like figure out what it would be. So it could be something like, what would it be? If torturing babies for fun is wrong, regardless of what anyone thinks, then moral realism is true. Torturing babies for fun is wrong, regardless of what anyone thinks. Therefore, moral realism is true. So it's pretty easy to infer what the other premise would be. But I really doubt JPA was running up against some character limit that would prevent him from laying out, a pretty standard modus ponens. So like why not do that? It's good practice just to be very clear and specific with your formal arguments, and this is not clear or specific. But it's just the kind of empty formalism that just doesn't amount to any sort of substantive argument. I mean, for one thing, like you would have to analyze what's meant by torturing babies for fun is wrong, regardless of what anyone thinks. And if you unpack that, either that's going to just trivially be some sort of entailment of moral realism, or it's not. If it is, then the question is pretty hollow. It's like, hey, if some trivial thing that would only be true if realism is true, then realism is true. That trivial thing is true, so realism is true. I mean, you might as well have an argument like this. If these footprints I found on the ground are genuinely from Bigfoot, then Bigfoot exists. They are genuinely from Bigfoot, so Bigfoot exists. Why would anyone that doubts that Bigfoot exists accept that the footprints on the ground are genuinely from Bigfoot? Of course, that implies Bigfoot exists. So the argument is no better than that. It's not necessarily like invalid, but it's a completely toothless kind of argument. But you also have the problem that it just relies a whole lot on this phrase: torturing babies for fun is wrong, regardless of what anyone thinks. So if you unpack that, if by what anyone thinks you means anyone excluding me, then I would just say that that's like it's wrong regardless of what anyone else thinks. Then I would agree that that's true, but that doesn't entail realism. So torturing babies for fun is wrong on my view. I don't care what other people think about it. So you get these scenarios that realists will give. They'll say, but imagine there was a world in which everyone in that world thought that baby torture was morally permissible or morally good or whatever. And like if you can't put yourself in that world because Let's say that the version of you in that world is dead, or the version of that you of you in that world has evil beliefs. Okay, well, it would be true that relative to the people in that world, nobody considers baby torture to be impermissible or wrong. But am I to be judging what would be right or wrong, like by the standards of me in the world or by the standards of me outside of the world? Because if you stipulate in advance that I'm not in the world, then I don't have a point of view. It'd be kind of like asking me, imagine a world where you don't exist. What point of view would you have in that world about how things appear from some vantage point that you don't occupy? It's a nonsense question. If I'm not in the world, I don't have a perspective. So how would you? What's your perspective? You might as well ask me a question. What would your perspective be if you didn't have a perspective? Well, I wouldn't have a perspective, so then I wouldn't be able to tell you what my perspective would be. So, that would be a nonsense question. But if you're asking me to judge according to my standards from outside of that world, like my actual standards, then I would say, yeah, it would still be wrong, even if it's not wrong according to anybody in that world. I don't particularly care what people in some counterfactual or hypothetical world think. I care about what I think. So when you disambiguate this remark, it either says something that would be um, true but consistent with anti-realism, or false, but it wouldn't have the kinds of implications that should make any kind of anti-realist balk at the claim. So it relies on this kind of ambiguity to make it seem like the anti-realist thinks that if other people think that torturing babies wasn't wrong, that torturing babies wouldn't be wrong. I don't care what other people think. The only thing that matters is what I think, uh, and I take these views to be descriptive views. And so, at best, what a realist could argue is, if I thought baby torture was not wrong, then I wouldn't think baby torture is wrong. Like that's the only thing I would be committed to. But realists are committed to that too. What are they going to do? Disagree that if I thought baby torture was not wrong, that I would not think baby torture is wrong? Of course, that would be true. So, what the anti-realist is doing with this particular analysis is they are treating all of the superficially normative claims, like what you might think are these irreducibly normative claims, as reducible to a type of descriptive relational claim about the relation between some agent and that agent's standards. They end up being a kind of descriptive claim. They're completely inoffensive and unobjectionable. But realists will say, but if you're an anti-realist, then you would have to agree that if someone thinks it's okay to torture babies, then it's good for them to torture babies. Well, no, because I'm not an agent relativist, so I don't think that. But if you say, but then you'd have to say, if that person said it's good to torture babies, that statement is true. Yes, it would be true. Now, if someone goes, they clutch their pearls and reel back in shock and horror from that, well, think about what that means. This is something that Ask Yourself, Isaac proposes, is try to get a realist who's presenting this objection to you, or an anti-realist that just doesn't like your particular anti-realist perspective, to analyze what you're committed to when you say that. So again, the sentence, when a person that's okay with baby torture says it's okay to torture babies, when they say that, if you're some type of appraiser relativist, that statement is true. But what does that mean? Well, the statement, it's okay to torture babies, is indexed to the speaker. So it's implicitly a report of their own standards. So when that person says it's okay to torture babies, that statement would be analyzed as, I approve of torturing babies. So if we imagine that there is a person that approves of torturing babies and that person says that they approve of torturing babies, it's trivially true that that person approves of torturing babies. What the hell is objectionable about that? Like, of course, people that approve of torturing babies approve of torturing babies. That has no implications for whether you approve of torturing babies or that you have to be okay with them torturing babies. So, realists routinely take advantage of the ambiguity of implicit indexicalization, which is, what an appraiser relativist would be, to give the very false and very misleading impression that the anti-realist is okay with baby torture. There's a constant attempt at insinuating falsely that the anti-realist is okay with all sorts of deplorable and terrible things. And what's really weird about this is that this is extremely obvious, that this is what many of these arguments amount to. They're completely vacuous horse shit. Like these are terrible arguments. They're arguments that rely not on explicitly coming out and saying here's a contradiction in the view, here's a problem with the view. They rely on insinuation, on implying that the anti-realist is committed to something terrible. And when you unpack and analyze what the anti-realist is committed to, it's all bullshit. They're not committed to any of these terrible implications. And yet realists continuously do this. day in and day out, and it's really quite frustrating. So this is not a good argument. It doesn't amount to anything, and you see this kind of stuff all the time. All right, let's see what we got here. Yeah, so Harmonica Luke says all one premise arguments are non sequiturs and circular, but yeah, it's implied here. Uh, Modus Poon. I haven't seen that PWN thing in a long time. Yeah. All right, so let's have a look at another one. Take a look at this tweet. So Matt Olma says, if moral disagreement doesn't imply that moral objectivism is false, then moral convergence doesn't imply that moral objectivism is true. Yeah. Well, I wouldn't take either of these to imply, like, disagreement shouldn't imply objectivism is false. Presumably, it would be one source of evidence. And likewise, convergence would be one source of evidence. I didn't take either to be like dispositive or definitive evidence, one way or another. But look at this response that Matt receives from someone named Sapphire. They respond by saying, moral disagreement would imply moral objectivism is true because if it was subjective, then there wouldn't be a fact of the matter to disagree on. Now, this is not true. And this is a common thing that critics will say about subjectivist views. Uh, so take a look at Matt's response. Matt says, yeah, I think that's a good point. It's funny that the laziest charge against subjectivism, moral disagreement, is probably, in fact, one of the strongest reasons for objectivism. This is not one of the strongest reasons for objectivism. The fact that people engage in disagreements does not entail that those people are realists or that they're implicitly committed to realism. Keep in mind what we have to do if we want to make that sort of claim. What do you mean by a disagreement? Now, if what you mean by a disagreement just is analytically a difference of when two or more people take different positions on what the stance independent moral facts are, then you can't just help yourself to the claim that people engage in moral disagreements, because what you would be saying is people take positions on what the stance independent moral facts are and then disagree about them. That would imply that those people are realists. That's the very thing you're supposed to demonstrate by appealing to disagreement. So you can't just stipulate your way to saying people are moral realists because they take positions on what the stance independent moral facts are. You can't take a stance on what the stance independent moral facts are unless you're a realist. So you might as well just say people are realists because they're realists. That would be ridiculous. And so what we need to do is think more carefully about what the actual observations that we observe in the real world are. So what we observe are people going, abortion's wrong. No, it's not. Yes, it is. No, it's not. We observe that kind of thing. We also observe people just like expressing moral claims in the indicative mood. So there's people that will say abortion is wrong, and there's people that will say abortion is not wrong. So first you have to disambiguate two different senses of disagreement. There's a disagreement in the kind of non-confrontational sense. There's a disagreement in the sense of like one person can think A and another person could be anywhere in the world could think not A. And those people don't have to be talking to each other. They don't have to interact with one another. And yet you could look at the fact that, like, Alex over here thinks A and Sam over there thinks not A and say they disagree with each other. Now, they could have never spoken to each other. You could even take, some statement from a person that died 1,000 years ago that says A. Like, let's say, person 1,000 years ago, you see in their journal, they're like, I truly believe God exists. And then you find an atheist today and they say God doesn't exist. You could say, yeah, they disagree. But it's not like they're arguing with each other. What you also can observe is that in actual instances of people engaged in a social interaction, someone will say, God exists. Another person goes, no, God doesn't exist. And that's a different kind of disagreement. One is simply the fact that two or more individuals can report or express conflicting propositional claims. And then in the latter case, two people can be engaged in a kind of social altercation. It doesn't have to be a hostile one. It could be two people calmly discussing whether God exists or not. But the latter is a kind of social disagreement. Those are two different kinds of disagreements. Shouldn't philosophers be making conceptual distinctions like this? So when they say, if you're a subjectivist, you can't disagree, which one of these are they talking about? Uh, it's also worth, as an aside, when people say that this person says subjectivism, uh, cultural relativists could disagree for sure. So you take two people, one of them says abortion is wrong, and one says abortion is not wrong. If they're members of the same culture, then there actually would be a fact about which one of them is correct and which one of them is incorrect with respect to their culture standards. So it's trivially easy to get genuine disagreement on that particular stance-dependent cognitivist perspective, some type of cultural relativism. It's also possible to get disagreement on various types of constructivism. You could have someone that's an ideal observer theorist and another person that's an ideal observer theorist. They're both anti-realists, and then they disagree on what. Ideal observer theory would be what would an ideal agent think about what is morally right or wrong, that's what's morally right or wrong. So it'd be an agent that's like perfectly rational, free from any biases, fully informed, it's omniscient, it has all knowledge. What would that being think is morally right or wrong? Two people could disagree on what that being would think. And so they're still anti-realist because they think moral facts are stance dependent. Um, but they have different normative moral positions, and so one of them, at least one of them, would be incorrect. Maybe they're both incorrect, depending on what the issue is. If it's mutually exhaustive, like it's A or not A, then maybe it would have to be one and not the other. So just the general point is, um, anti-realists are perfectly capable of disagreeing with one another. But what about individual subjectivists? Absolutely, they could disagree with one another. You have to be clear on what you mean by disagreement. So in both the case, in the former case, it's just a feature of what a disagreement is to be a difference on people's like two people hold different positions on the status of some propositional claim. One thinks it's true, one thinks it's false, or they endorse propositions that are mutually exclusive. Like one thinks P, one thinks not P, or one thinks P and one thinks Q, but Q implies not P, or something like that. So that's where you could have like a disagreement in a kind of trivial sense, where disagreement is exclusively a narrow. Sorry, I shouldn't say it's trivial. Um, where disagreement is understood to specifically be a difference of one's position on the truth status of a propositional claim. That's one sense of disagreement. But then think about other cases where you might say that people disagree with one another. So let's say you go to a car dealership and you want to buy a car and you think, okay, this thing's not worth more than 8 grand. And the dealership offers 10 grand, the salesperson that you're working with. And you're like, no, 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 I'll give you a seven. And they're like, nine. And you're like, seven and a half. And they say, the lowest I could go is eight. You're like, fine, I'll take eight. Now, before you reach that agreement, one could say you disagree about the price. You might even argue and raise points for your position. You might say, look, the car has a couple scratches on the back of it, and that should really lower its value. And look, you told me it had 50,000 miles. It actually is 57,000 miles. So you underestimated the total amount of mileage on it. You might say when you drove it, it wasn't quite as smooth as you were expecting. But they might point out that the market is like really restrictive at the moment, and this car has performed really well. Like they haven't, they're known for not needing extensive repairs. So they could raise points. You could raise points. You would be arguing. And yet, do we think that there is car price realism, that there's a stance independent fact? There's a fact about the true price of the car that is true independent of what you or that salesperson or what anyone else thinks about the price of that car? No, that's ridiculous. The price is whatever you're both willing to agree to. Uh, assuming there aren't outside constraints or something like that. Maybe the dealership wouldn't let them sell it to you for 3 grand. But what you're doing there is you're negotiating a difference in goals. And so the kind of sloganized form of this is that people don't just disagree about what's true, they disagree about what to do. And the latter kind of disagreement, I don't know which of these is more common, but it might very well be the more common of the two. There's going to be very few instances in which people are coldly disinterestedly disputing what's true or false, and they just don't care. It has no practical relevance. But there may be many cases where people are arguing over matters of practical relevance where they do not think there's some stance independent normative fact of the matter. And so it could be that almost every case in which people actually disagree, there's a consideration of practical relevance, like they care about the outcome. There's something that they disagree about what you should do or what should happen. Um, with respect to their goals or their values or their interests. But there might not. So, in other words, like disputes about what's true might be subordinate to, in almost every case, disputes about what to do. While the latter isn't true, you're just not going to find a whole lot of cases where people are specifically disputing what's true without any investment in whether or not it's true. They might anyway. People could argue about like trivia, and they don't specifically care about whether, like, I don't know, pygmy marmosets live like in this specific region or something like that. Um, so, just the general point here is that it's an open empirical question. When we go out and we observe people arguing or making points or saying that's not true, that is true, or saying this is good or this is bad or this is right or this is wrong, that those people are presupposing, or that the only way we can make sense of what they're doing is in virtue of them presupposing or being committed to there being some dispute about what the stance independent normative facts are. That's not the only way to make sense of disagreement. People can argue because they want something and someone else has a conflict with them and wants something else, and it's really a matter of negotiation or diplomacy that they're engaged in. So when that occurs, of course people are going to argue. So this idea, sometimes people would think, well, it's because the rationale for subjectivists, not really disagreeing is super superficial and lazy. So something like this: if I say abortion is not morally wrong, and I'm a subjectivist, what I mean is I don't disapprove of abortion. But then if I run into somebody and they do disapprove of abortion and they say abortion is morally wrong, but I think they're a subjectivist too, and maybe they are. Um, so it would be like if I walked up to somebody and I said, I don't disapprove of abortion. And then they say, I do disapprove of abortion. Okay, so there's nothing we disagree about. So why are we arguing with one another? Isn't it obvious why we would be arguing with one another when two people actually come into conflict with one another in a social altercation? Let's say it's a bunch of pro-life people with signs like protesting outside an abortion clinic, um, and I'm there to support somebody that's going to get an abortion or whatever it might be, and I get in an argument. Are we just walking up to one another and going, "Proposition, proposition, proposition. Here's a proposition." No. What kind of idiotic view of human interaction thinks that people just walk up to one another and just spout out propositions? I don't just go up to people and just Mount Everest is the tallest mountain, and blah 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 blah. Blah. Mount Olympus is the tallest mountain in the solar system. Like I don't just report propositions to people. If people are arguing, imagine the situation, right? You have two people, and it's like, abortion is wrong. You're murdering babies. And they're like, I'm not murdering babies. They're not even conscious yet. Blah, 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 blah. Right to life. And blah, blah, blah. The other person says, right to life. Blah, blah, blah. And the other person says, bodily autonomy. And they argue with one another. Why would they have to disagree about what's like stance independently true or false? One person wants to outlaw abortion and punish people that try to get abortions. The other person wants to get an abortion or thinks people should be able to get abortions if they want to. They have different visions about what kind of world they want to see, what kind of place they want to live in. They have disagreements about what to do, what the policy should be, what the law should be, how people should treat one another. None of that requires them to disagree about what stands independently true. Would you say that therefore they're not disagreeing? What kind of ridiculous, like, again, you don't have to think the only thing that could be properly construed as a disagreement is a dispute about facts. If you do, that's just narrowly using the term. And uh, also, if you just say disagreements just are disputes about what the facts are, fine. Then those people arguing aren't disagreeing. I can't account for disagreement. Uh, but that's not a disagreement. And so now you can't help yourself to the assumption that there are actual observations that subjectivists can't account for. In other words, if you want to just stipulate or insist that a disagreement just is a dispute about what the facts are, then those instances are not disagreements. And so now you can't say, hey, here's an observation, disagreements are occurring, but the subjectivists can't account for them. No, if you want to stipulate that disagreements are disputes about what the facts are, then I would just say, okay, well, it's an open question whether those people are disputing what the facts are. So you don't get to just help yourself to the assumption that that's what they're doing. It's an empirical question what they are doing and what they take themselves to be doing. You would have to actually figure out what they take themselves to be doing, what they're actually trying to do in those cases. So you cannot, like realists do this and armchair philosophers do this all the time. They try to circumvent actually handling empirical considerations by just stipulative and declarative fiat, and it doesn't work that way. That's not how reality works. If you want to know what those people are doing, you have to get your hands dirty and do some damn empirical studies. And they just don't do it. They just think you could resolve these matters by sitting in a chair thinking. That's not how you resolve these matters. You resolve them by actually doing a freaking study. So do some damn studies and shut up about it. Man, it's frustrating. All right. All right. Okay. So um, I'm not seeing a bunch of comments or questions in the chat. So I guess it's a quiet night. Maybe I should have done this a lot earlier. What do you think? Is not a good time to do it? Um, so that's what I have to say about that. I think I think maybe I'll do a short stream and deal with the Mike humor stuff later. I don't know. I said I was going to, but it's already late and I'm already tired. I don't know. I don't. There's not a lot of chat right now. My energy is like it synergizes with a lively chat. So since people aren't real active, I'm like I'm not feeling it right now. Yeah, I'm not feeling it. I'm not feeling it. So I'm gonna have to rename the video and cover this in another video. Let me see if there's something else for me to dispute because I'm not feeling up for that one. Or maybe we just keep it a short stream. What do you think? Looking through the chat here. Jeremy Gord says, if disagreement were about the truth of propositions, would this explain the emotions people show? No, probably not. Because just because, yeah, and this is one thing to say is like subjectivism actually makes better sense of what we observe when people are actually arguing with one another. Because imagine two people simply disagree on the truth status of some proposition. Okay, so like why would they care? Right. And so in actual instances in which people come into conflict with one another, about like an abortion or something like that. They don't just disagree about what propositions are. They have different goals about what they want the world to be like, what policies they want to see passed, what laws they want to see passed, what they want people to do. And that makes far more sense as a subjectivist than it does as a realist, unless the realist presumes that everybody is interested in what the stance independent moral facts are. But that's exactly the thing that I'm disputing. Like they haven't established that. They're not welcome to just help themselves to that assumption. So there's something very strange about people thinking that the persistence of disagreement is only explicable by appealing to moral realism. I'll rest for a little bit and then we'll see if I'm up for the humor post. We'll see. But yeah, there's Matt says it's off topic, but I have a question about language meaning internalism and AI. I don't think I'm the right person to ask. I don't work on that stuff. You could go ahead and ask, but I may just not have much to say about that. Yeah, I guess I just got started too late. I'm already out of steam after 20 minutes. That's rare for me. Yeah, I could do a little bit of the humor stuff. We could always split it up into 2. That's no problem. So Matt says, "You've mentioned that words don't mean things, people mean things." Yep, that's my view. Matt says, "What happens when ChatGPT generates text that seems meaningful? I take it ChatGPT doesn't mean things." Yeah, it doesn't. And so what you would do in those cases is you would interpret that text and do whatever it is with that text that appears useful to you. So it's not like I'm reifying meaning. It's not like I think that because ChatGPT is spitting out words that it doesn't intend to communicate anything in particular, that you're like stuck going, oh no, it doesn't have intentions. And so it's everything it's saying is gibberish. I have no way to interpret it. What you would be doing in these cases is basically projecting onto it the presumption of it being some type of intentional agent whose purpose is to communicate useful information to you. You then treat it accordingly and take that information for what it's worth. So it's a type of information extraction tool, and you use it for whatever purposes you're using it for. So what I don't think is that uh, when a person says something that because like they fix the meaning of the terms that there's like this special properties are generated of like meaningness, and so like if nobody is intending to mean something by the sentence, then the sentence like can't be used or has to be regarded as gibberish. That's not what the view would be. There's going to be psychological facts about what people are trying to communicate in a given context. There's going to be facts about what inferences another person makes about what that person's trying to do, and that interpretation is going to be how that person ends up responding to what the other person is doing. In the case of ChatGPT interacting with this, there's a kind of simulated response. Think of the reaction that you would get to, like, if ChatGPT was telling you a joke. It's not like you wouldn't be able to laugh at the joke. If it insults you, it's not like you would be incapable of being offended, although you might not be. Uh, so it really depends on what it's saying, how you're thinking about it, how you're interpreting it. But I don't think there's any deep mystery there. Yeah. So Jeremy says, I think it does mean things. It's just not pragmatics free semantics, which is incoherent, but rather has a pragmatics that's very alien to us. That's one way to put it. Um, I would consider that as a possibility for how to look at this. Um, I'd have to think about that. That's interesting. I'm not inclined to say that. I'm inclined to say that um, there's it. Yeah, I'm inclined to say that it doesn't mean anything in the sense that I think that people mean things, and that what we're doing in these cases is using strings of text, like where we're imputing a kind of like interpretation or quasi meaning onto it, and then using that. But I don't really have the I haven't thought about it enough, to be honest. So I don't know how good of an answer that is. Probably not a great answer, but it's a cool question. It's nice to grapple with a question that's not exactly in my meta ethics wheelhouse. All right, so let's have a look at this humor article. Uh, they have a new feature here: presenter invite. Oh, I see. So this is an article from a couple days ago called "Debunking Skepticism." So let's have a look. So I saw this a couple days ago, and I saw debunking skepticism, but it just said skepticism. It didn't say moral skepticism, or I would have jumped on it right away. So let's have a look. So Huber says here that he's going to debunk the moral skeptics. Um, this is based on debunking skepticism. Okay. So I had a few issues with this. I'm writing up a blog post on this, and it's actually quite long already. It'll address this like sort of point by point. So that'll be out in I don't know when it's going to be out. The next few days. It's not going to be too long before I get it done. So look how he starts. I already have issues with this from the outset. And maybe if we go read that article, I haven't read the article that he referenced at the beginning. A lot of this would be clarified, but as a standalone blog post, I do have some issues with this. Have a look at this first characterization in the introduction. I'm talking about this here. It says moral skeptics argue that either there aren't any moral facts or there are, but we don't know them. Why? Because our mechanisms for forming moral beliefs are not reliably truth directed. So, right out of the gate, I have a few concerns here. First, when he says moral skeptics argue that there either aren't any moral facts or there are, but we don't know about them. By moral facts, does he mean stance independent moral facts or not? If you're a moral relativist or a constructivist, or as I prefer the term, a stance dependent cognitivist, um, are you a moral skeptic or are you not a moral skeptic? It's hard to tell from this remark. If by moral facts he means stance independent moral facts, why doesn't he specify that? That seems like exactly the kind of thing that it would be really important to specify in this context, because what you have on the table is a delineation between different sorts of meta ethical positions, and failing to like explicitly lay out an important distinction. Like, you should lay it out even if you do include like if you exclude them, exclude relativism and constructivist positions, or you include them, it's still helpful to say stance independent moral facts, or if you don't mean that, to say moral facts parentheses including both stance dependent and stance independent. Or did I say stance dependent first? Yeah. So, like, just be clear either way. So, in other words, regardless of whether he intends to include or exclude constructivist and relativist positions, that should be specified. And that under specificity is real frustrating because, it's the thing I say, like, analytic philosophy is supposed to be about precision and clarity. This is not precise or clear. It's just not precise or clear. So that's a problem. Uh, so then we also have this, the way he's characterizing the view. He says moral skeptics argue that either there aren't any moral facts or there are, but we don't know them. Why? Because our mechanisms for forming moral beliefs are not reliably truth directed. So here's another problem. By moral skeptic, does he mean someone who thinks that there are no moral facts, or if there are, we don't know about them? And then he's done with the definition. And then in addition, he's saying, here's a reason why people might be a moral skeptic. Or is he including as part of the definition of a moral skeptic someone who thinks there are no moral facts, or that there are, but we can't know about them? And in addition, another requirement to be a moral skeptic is that they specifically think that our mechanisms for forming moral beliefs are not reliably truth directed. It's not clear from here which one of those he's referring to. Is that part of the definition or not part of the definition? So this is unfortunately unclear writing. It's not clear which he means. Now, if I go around and ask people, I'm sure people are going to tell me it's obvious that he's including or excluding it. I don't buy it. If it shouldn't be, you shouldn't have to read something and like infer. You should just make it clear from the outset. And this is not clear from the outset. And then he says, um, two sub arguments. Again, it's just underspecified. Are these the only 2 sub-arguments? Are these 2 common sub-arguments? There's no qualifiers, there's no caveats. It's just not particularly clear. Now, you might think that it's nitpicky. I don't think this is nitpicky because the kind of thing that happens is I might respond saying, "Well, I'm an anti-realist, blah, 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 blah." And then someone could respond and say, "Well, but as per this definition, and you think there's moral facts, you're not even a moral skeptic, so this doesn't apply to you." That's the kind of shit that I encounter from people, not necessarily from Humor himself, but from someone in a comment. And then I have to say, well, it wasn't clear. And then that person will say, no, it was clear. Oh, well, this kind of crap happens all the time. And it could be easily avoided by people simply adequately specifying what they mean. And he just doesn't do that here. And it's really, really, really frustrating. So, that's frustrating. Patrick says, also, atheists think there are a very large number of moral facts. They're all false, but that's what they say. Well, that's not clear that that's true. So, if by a fact you mean a statement that could be capable of being true or false, but they're all false, then are those facts? Like fact, I wouldn't typically use the term fact to mean like truth app positions. I would use it to specifically mean truth app positions that are true. Uh, did I say positions? Truth apt propositions that are true. So I wouldn't use the term that way, and I doubt most error theorists would. So I'm going to have to disagree with you on that one. But I think that it is a possible usage to mean basically statements that could be true or false. Okay. Harmonica Luke says if we could reliably detect stance independent moral facts, then moral disagreement would be hard to explain. Well, it could be that we can reliably detect them, but the people that claim not to are a bunch of just straight up liars. That's a possibility. It's also possible that we can reliably detect them, but it requires some degree of training. So people can reliably do certain like high level math stuff, but like I can't do it and most people can't. It requires training. So it could be that it requires a certain level of expertise or reflection for people to employ their intuitions reliably. So I don't think that this is necessarily true. I think realists would have responses to this. Patrick says, no, I wouldn't either, but error theorists tend to say fact. I'm not sure about that. I don't know. I'm not saying you're wrong, but I haven't seen error theorists communicate their position in that way. Maybe you're right. Okay, so let's keep going. So he says that there's two sub arguments. The first, our moral intuitions are produced by something that is insensitive to moral truth, like natural selection or the cultural traditions we happen to be born under. And the second is there's so much disagreement among moral judgments that we have to conclude that humans can't reliably judge morally. So I never took the latter, the existence of widespread moral disagreement, to be a particularly good argument against realism. I think it's quite weak. And I know there's attempts to bolster it. I don't find any of them convincing. Um, I think that there could be persistent disagreement about something among reasonable people, even for things for which I think there's some stance, roughly stance independent fact of the matter. So I don't take that to be particularly good evidence of anti realism or against realism. As far as the first one, I am not a proponent of evolutionary debunking arguments that appeal to natural selection as having some sort of unavoidable biasing influence that makes our moral judgments unreliable, like they're not truth tracking. I do think that something like the cultural tradition approach is correct, though. So I favor a kind of cultural debunking argument, but it's not a very traditional one. I think that moral realism is largely confined to academic philosophers and people influenced by them, and that the cultural influence that is causing philosophers to mistakenly think that realism is true is due to induction into thinking about philosophy. I don't think it's this thing that's like widespread in culture. In other words, like I don't even think Western culture more generally is disposed towards prompting people to be moral realists. I deny that Christianity or monotheism in general favors moral realism. I've never seen any compelling scriptural evidence that the Bible favors moral realism. I don't buy it, and I haven't seen good arguments for it. So I think that theism more generally is completely consistent with anti-realism, and that this realism stuff is largely just something that philosophers invented. I don't think it reflects how ordinary people think. I think there's no good evidence that that's true. I think there's some decent evidence that it's probably not true. And yeah. So the kind of culture I'm talking about would be like the analytic philosophical subculture, something like that. So it's a very different kind of argument than would be typical of most cultural debunking arguments. It would be very much a kind of late Wittgenstein inspired type of cultural objection. All right. So Here's the critical move that humor ends up making. So he says, I suggest that there are similar arguments debunking skepticism itself. Skeptical beliefs are produced by unreliable processes that produce lots of disagreement. So I think that there's a lot of problems with this. I mean, one is he's kind of just lumping skepticism about realism in with some sort of broader skepticism. And two, he ends up just speculating on ways in which skeptics might be skeptical for various reasons that could be rooted in biased reasoning processes. Uh, but I mean, this is a goose and gander thing. I could come up with a bunch of reasons why realists could be biased and their positions would be the result of unreliable processes. Um, I'm not sure like who wins. Like if someone's going to say, okay, well, if they're all unreliable, then none of us know anything. Well, I don't know what to do at that point, but I don't think that there's anyone has convincingly shown, and I don't think he shows here that there's something especially compromised about the views of skeptics relative to the views that realists have. And I think that humor ends up helping himself to certain assumptions about the non-skeptical positions that I very much reject. So let's get into it. Well, we could have a look at the chat real quick. Real name says, Lance, do you think that things like chairs, apples, etc., exist in a sense independent way? Yes, that has to be qualified by the fact that I'm a pragmatist, and so there is an ineliminable perspectival element to my views. So I do think that there's a relativistic aspect of truth, but there's a huge difference between being a pragmatist about truth and thinking that's a statement that is true according to one like frame of reference or standard, but not true according to another, or in a different time or place, or according to some different way of life. So it's true in one standard and not in another. There's a sense in which that would make me some type of relativist about truth, but that can give people the misleading impression that if you're a pragmatist, that you think truth is like a matter of personal preference or a matter of personal expedience, or that truth is can be changed on a whim. That is not true, and pragmatists are not committed to something like that. There's been a kind of century plus slander of pragmatists that they are some sort of crude and stupid relativist, and they're not. And I do not think that like facts about, I don't know, apples or chairs, that those facts can vary based on like a whim or a preference in the way that one's judgments about like a movie or the taste of food being good or bad can change based on a preference. So I do think that there is an important conceptual distinction between the two, and I reserve stance independent for the former and stance dependent for the latter. And so my views about stance independence is like stance independence with an asterisk, like stance independent in a way that roughly mirrors what other people mean by that. Um, I mean, there might be some technical fundamental differences. If I had to stop using that language, though, I wouldn't be able to have these discussions at all. So there are qualifications and caveats behind what I'm saying. But generally speaking, uh, I think that there are facts that are not determined by your preferences or desires in any straightforward and direct way. It's not like if I prefer X, then X is true. I don't think that that's the case for the existence of chairs. Like I can't make chairs stop existing by preferring they don't exist. All right. So real name says, how are moral facts different from chair facts or apple facts? Like, what if I think an apple is a kind of chair because you could sit on an apple? Uh, promise I'm not trying to be difficult. I take these I would take claims about what chairs are and what apples are to be questions to be navigated in a somewhat practical manner. Um, there's going to be there's going to be questions to ask about what kinds of divisions we want to make in the world. Is this a question of labeling or a question of the nature of the thing? So the fact that you could sit on an apple, like you and I could agree, like, okay, let's say I agree with you exactly how easy it is to sit on an apple. And I say, I don't want to call that a chair. And you do want to call it a chair. I don't think you're incorrect in calling it a chair. We agree on all the facts. We just disagree on how to label them. If instead you think, no, 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 fundamentally, apples are chairs in some deep metaphysical sense, I wouldn't agree with that view because it would be rooted in a metaphilosophical view I don't endorse in the first place. So, like, I don't think anything is essentially a chair. So, something a friend said to me, he said, if you think about it, everything in the universe is more or less a potato. So potatoes are like you could actually do this indexing, right? Where potatoes, like on something is zero if it's like maximally not a potato, and something is a one if it's a potato. It's like the potato index is how much it's like a potato. It's a one. And then you could say like, okay, well, what about like a rutabaga or a turnip? Maybe that's like a point relative to everything else in the universe. It's like a 0.99 or something. What about like a banana as a 0.98? What about like a human? Maybe a 0.7 or something. As you know, we're made of many similar organic compounds or something like that. So pretty potato like. Uh, okay, but then as you move down the scale, you would have things be increasingly less potato like. So you could think of apples as being more or less chair-like if you want to. I just don't think that anything is like fundamentally or essentially a chair or an apple or something like that. I do think that there are reliably recurring patterns that one would observe in nature so that like, aliens are going to come up with a periodic table. It's not like they're just going to be completely baffled by reality or have a radically different model of that. Um, so, certain sorts of categories and distinctions are reliably recurring in ways that influence our perceptions, our experiences, the predictions that we make in ways that are so consistent and so reliably useful from, to organisms of different progenies and histories and objectives that they're going to converge in many ways on mapping the world and forming theories about the world that are heavily overlapping with one another. And then in other ways, they wouldn't. And uh, there's going to be some sort of area between those two. Amscombe says, "Is there a text where you give your cultural views on development and morality if you haven't written them out? Any work you best accompanies your view outside of PI?" Um, I don't know if I've written about this much. Maybe in my early blog stuff. As far as where you could find out more about that kind of view, cultural views about the development of morality. Yeah, there's a few articles. So one of them would be Mastery's paper, Morality, a Historical Invention, and another would be The Moral Domain by Stephen Stitch. Those are in the Atlas of Moral Psychology. I think it came out in 2018, and the editor should be Kurt Gray. Those are two short articles. They're really good. So again, Mastery, Morality, a Historical Invention, and Stitch, The Moral Domain, both fairly short articles. Stitch has another article, I think it's called Delineating the Moral Domain. It's a bit longer and more detailed. And Mastery has a great article with Mastery and Malin called Evolution of Morality. Those are all big influences on me. They're not super long or detailed or anything like that. Well, Evolution of Morality is a pretty long chapter. Uh, that's a little hard to locate. That's in the Moral Psychology Handbook. I think Doris and Nichols are the editors for that one. What else is there? Big influence on me was Kim Sterelny's The Evolved Apprentice. That's a great book. He has a new, bigger book out that I want to check out. That seems like it's going to be good and up my alley. Other stuff that's influenced me is Richardson and Boyd and Gene Culture Coevolutionary Accounts. Um, what else? Just a smattering of papers, lots of articles, fewer books. All right. So let's keep going with the article a little bit. So the next thing Humor says is philosophers as a group have an extreme skeptical leaning compared to people from other disciplines. For virtually anything that philosophers talk about, not just morality, one of the leading philosophical theories will be an extreme form of skepticism. This is not true of any other field that I know of. So I already have a problem with this. He uses the term extreme here, and then later he uses the term radical. Now, the problem with those terms is they're highly normatively loaded. If you say that this is an extreme or radical position, what exactly does that mean? I think that there is an implicit presumption here that for a philosopher to take an extreme or radical skeptical position on the matter is for them to be extreme or radical relative to what is taken to be an intuitive, commonsensical, or default position, a position that may appear to be the case or is obvious. But I don't grant that rejecting that we have knowledge of stance independent moral facts or that there are stance independent moral facts is in any way counterintuitive or radical or extreme in those respects. If he means that they're like unpopular among what population? So we would have to get specific about that. And that's probably not going to be a good enough characterization. Um, It's like it's unpopular. If he means that, why not say that? But also, that just doesn't seem to sufficient to capture the normative element of saying that the position is radical or extreme or whatever. So already, I think he's helping himself to the presumption that there is something deviant, or I don't even know exactly what he means when he says the position is radical or extreme. But I'm a moral anti-realist. I deny there's anything radical or extreme about the position. I take it to be obvious. I basically view moral realism the same way I would view someone claiming that they had like telepathic powers or that they could see auras. I take realism to be in a very extreme position, and I don't really care whether 62% of philosophers endorse realism. That doesn't make it all that much less extreme to me. What if 62% of philosophers thought that we should, you know, kill and torture all animals? Okay, well, that's an extreme position. I don't care what if 99% of them thought that, I would think it was extreme. If extreme means something like very far from what I would consider plausible. And so there's something highly subjective about calling something extreme. Um, unless you want to stipulate some sort of definition, but he doesn't do that. Uh, this is frustratingly vague what this might mean. So let's keep going. So he says, among chemists, a leading theory is not that there are no chemicals or that we know nothing about them. Among geologists, there's no theory that takes seriously that there are no rocks. Among art historians, a major view isn't that there is no art or that it has no history. But among epistemologists, a leading theory is that there is no knowledge. Among ethicists, a major theory is that there is no right or wrong. When philosophers theorize about free will, so he goes on to say that um, basically in the sciences, they take their subject matter for granted. They agree that it exists, and nobody seriously theorizes that the phenomena in question don't exist. You don't have biologists thinking that living things don't exist. You don't have astronomers that say, yeah, maybe stars don't even exist. Those would be radically skeptical positions for those fields. But in philosophy, you have skeptics about various sorts of phenomena. There's a very big difference here, which is that um, it's almost like a precondition for working in the special sciences that you accept that the things exist in much the way like, uh, you know, it'd be very hard to be like a practicing astrologer and take it seriously, but like not believe in astrology. It'd be very hard to be like a ghost hunter, but not believe you're actually like purging ghosts. Certain sorts of exercises or disciplines, the very practice of the discipline sort of presupposes the existence of the thing in question. It'd be very hard to be a chef if you don't think food is real. Whereas in philosophy, the very issues in question are fundamental disputes about whether the things exist or not. It's not like it's a precondition for doing philosophy that you think we have knowledge or that God exists or that there are stance independent moral facts. Philosophy is this fundamental discipline that questions everything. And so it's not like some kind of precondition of the discipline that you accept that those things are real. So first you have that. Uh, so like I'm not sure that there's a particularly good comparison here. But second, it's like an open question. What sorts of things would be like extreme to be skeptical about? Like I still don't know what he's basing this on. Like, I would agree it'd be very weird to deny that rocks exist or that chemicals exist, but I don't agree that there's anything strange about denying that moral facts exist. Now, if we look at the stuff on this list, like, what does he mean by knowledge? Like, depending on what he means, I might think that there's no knowledge, and I wouldn't find anything especially extreme radical about that. Um, Certainly, I don't find skepticism about morality to be even remotely extreme or radical. He says, like, when philosophers theorize about free will, someone is going to say that there is no such thing. Yes, I think that's pretty much the only reasonable position to take on free will. I mean, I take a quietist position. I think that the concept is so confused and ill posed that there's no fact of the matter. So I think that puts me in like the um, I wouldn't say there is no fact of the matter about whether we have free will. I would say something like, yeah, I think I might say something like that. So if you look at the Phil paper survey, I think that's like 1% of the respondents. So I endorse a view that's only endorsed by 1%. I think it's 11 or 12% say that we have no free will. That's not exactly my position. So even best case scenario, if I went with that larger category, I'd be in like the 11%. But if I go with the actual category that represents my views, I think it's one of the lowest on the list, which is like less than one. I think it's 0.97%, something like that. I was just writing about it, so that number sounds right to me. Um, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what it is. Let's look. I have it saved here. Yep. 0.97%, there's no fact of the matter. And then another similar one would be the question is too unclear to answer, and it's 2.5%. So, uh, are those extreme radical views? Well, if you're going by like the popularity account of extreme or radical, then absolutely, those are extreme radical views. But as far as like intuitive plausibility, I don't have free will intuitions. So, like, what am I supposed to do under the circumstances? Am I supposed to defer to humor's intuitions? Why would I do that? Like, I don't think he has better intuitions than me. So, you have an issue here that like he's just helping himself to the assumption that moral skepticism is in some way radical or extreme, without specifying what that even means. Okay, so he says, of course, these radical positions, skeptical positions, are usually small minority views. Nevertheless, the profession takes them seriously and spends a lot of time discussing them, as no one in any other discipline would do. Good. They should do that. As far as these positions being like small minority positions, uh, Hume's position is non naturalist realism. That's 26.6% of philosophers. Anti realism is 26.1%. It's not big differences. And Humer, in a recent interview, even said that, it might make more sense to focus on the division between ethical intuitionism, which he was using there more or less interchangeably with non-naturalism. I'm not really sure why. Um, anyway, he said it was like a more central dispute would be the non-naturalists with everybody else. So that would put his position at an approximately similar amount, because 26.6 and 26.1, half a percent difference. It's not a big difference. So Humer's position isn't substantially more common than anti-realism. Now you could say, but you could split up anti-realism into expressivism and error theory and various types of constructivism or cognitive stance-dependent accounts. And you could even throw my quietism in there, be like the one person on the survey that has that response. Um, I didn't actually answer the official survey, so I would be, if I were given the survey, I might be the one person on there. You could do that, but note that those differences are largely semantic differences. They're not deep and fundamental metaphysical differences. Not really. And in fact, they're not even all that deep and fundamentally different from naturalist realism. Naturalist realism largely disagrees with these views on like semantic issues, not so much like a naturalist and me might look at the world and think that the world is more or less the same and has the same sorts of things in it. There might be some quibbling or disputes, but they're not going to be ones that are all that practically significant for most naturalist accounts. The biggest difference really is between the non-naturalists and everybody else. So I agree with Humer about that. And if we focus on that division, then his position is a kind of minority position. It's 26.6%, and then everybody else holds some other contrary position. So there's something off about the framing of this dispute, and people are all too happy to seize on that 62%. They use it just constantly, people appealing to that number like it matters. It's so weird. Okay, so the next thing he says is the next section, when beliefs are open to bias, he says, well, what kinds of beliefs are susceptible to being influenced by bias? He mentions a few considerations. You can see them here. I don't find this to be all that interesting. I will note, though, that some of these are a little obscure. Like he says, beliefs stated in vague terms rather than precise terms. Is this a distinctive issue for anti-realists? I don't think so. So I'm a little puzzled as to what he's focusing on here. Some of these are a little funny. Beliefs based on abstract reflection rather than observation, scientific study, and then also beliefs that rely on empirical speculation. And when he says empirical speculation, he gives an example here. They claim that moral beliefs are adaptations, specific evolutionary explanations for specific moral beliefs. So, I don't think morality is an adaptation, biological adaptation. So there's something off about these um, beliefs that are ideologically significant. Here, I would just disagree. I don't think that the realism anti-realism dispute is ideologically significant. I think realists might think that, but I don't. So there may be an asymmetric bias that's specifically more distinctive for realists, maybe some other anti-realists, but not me. So um, beliefs that require high level judgment calls. I don't know why that would make us especially prone to bias, but ones that don't require this wouldn't be prone to bias. So this is a little underdeveloped. I don't really know what he's trying to do here exactly. He does say that skepticism exhibits all of these traits. I'm not convinced that it does. I'm not convinced that they're unique to skepticism. I'm not sure that this is really doing much to show that skepticism is a result of unreliable processes. So yeah, and notice how he concludes. So skepticism and the arguments for it are exactly the type of belief and argument that we would expect to easily be influenced by bias should someone have a pro-skeptic bias. This is this is very soft. Like it's highly speculative. It's highly underdeveloped. Um, they're exactly the kinds of views we'd expect to easily be influenced by bias. Okay, so he's speculated that these are some possible sources of bias. He hasn't shown that the beliefs in question are in fact subject to these types of bias in any specific population of skeptics, nor has he shown that the level of bias caused by these factors is of comparatively great extent to elevate the bias in this question to be like a like easily influenced by bias. He hasn't shown that. All he's done is said these are the sorts of things like these are some potential biasing factors. Um, Okay, and how big of a deal are they? That's an empirical question. Do we have data on that? No, we don't. So this is massively speculative, and it's also like relative to what other views though, because someone could potentially raise similar considerations for all sorts of philosophical views, non-philosophical views. How do we specify how much bias is influencing people and how much of a factor that is in undermining the truth tracking nature of their beliefs? Just it's very underspecified, and it just makes it like he's painting a vague target that makes it hard to criticize the view because it's so underdeveloped as a perspective. All right, looking at the chat. Jeremy says, "What do you think about the fixity malleability of different people's meta-ethical positions in terms of personality psychology?" I don't know. It'd be super speculative. Since I don't think most people have meta-ethical positions, this would really be a question that would partially be contingent on the psychology of philosophers in particular and people influenced by them. And I just don't have enough information about that. But if you're wondering about the general corrigibility or incorrigibility of people's meta-ethical positions, that's a good question. I really don't know. I don't know how often people change their mind. It would be interesting to find out. Like, do more people become anti-realists or do more people become realists that were originally the other position? I don't know. Okay. So he goes on to discuss several biases, but I think I want to save these for a future analysis. There's a lot there, and I think there's some stuff in there that's pretty juicy. So I'll get to that the next time. We'll do a kind of part two where we dig more into this, and some of the juicy stuff is going to be in the next section. I think I'm just too tired to give a good analysis of that for now. Let's see. There were a few short videos that I wanted to look at, so maybe I'll do that. Where did I save those? I know I saved them somewhere. Oh, they should be in here. Okay, give me a moment, and I'm gonna try to pull some of them up. And how are you all doing? It's been a quiet night. Not a lot of people talking tonight. It's okay. Sometimes it's good. Ba, 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 ba. Here's one of them. Oh no, that's a longer one. I had several shorts I wanted to go through. Yeah, here's one. Okay, not that one. This one. Yep. Oh, I don't even think I listened to that one. I just saved it. Well, that's a much longer talk. Oh, I thought I saved quite a few of these, and I just have two here. That's weird. Here's some more. Okay, here's one. Yep, great. Got that one. I got 3 so far. Oh, here's another good one. Great. Okay, let's go through these. Yeah, Jeremy says, "I keep forgetting that you guys are up late, 11:30 AM here." Yeah, it's 10:40 where I'm at, so I'm on the East Coast in the US. So, yeah. Jeremy, says, "Seems like I've been playing D&D pretty well for 35 years without believing that trolls exist." Um, yeah, do you play online or do you play in person? How does that work? Like, I've seen people playing D&D these days on, like, Discord and stuff. Jeremy's asking us that New Zealand. Talking about time zones. Yeah. Where are you all at? If you wanna share, you could share. It's certainly no obligation to share. Um, okay, now let's pop into one of these videos. So I saved several shorts that I wanted to have a look at. And
This
what was one
is the
that
most
I had a friend who was
okay, I could barely hear that. It's on maximum volume. Let me crank the volume up on this.
a philosophy professor at.
this is
I had a
Okay, can y'all hear it okay? I hope you can.
friend who was a philosophy professor at a university, and a student in his philosophy class turned in a paper to him in which he argued for moral relativism, that there are no moral values, no moral duties, everything is relative, and so forth. And my friend put an F on the paper and sent it back to the student, even though it was a good piece of work. And the student came into his office angry and said, "How can you give me this F? This was a good piece of research. How can you do that?" And the professor looked at it and he said, it was handed in a blue folder. And I don't like blue folders. The grade is an F. And the student said, "But that's not fair. You can't do that." And the professor said, "It's not what? Isn't this the paper that argued that there is no such thing as fairness and moral rightness and wrongness?"
No, it's not. Moral relativism is not the view that there's no such thing as moral rightness and wrongness. So what the hell is he talking about? Um, and then when he's like, "It's what? It's not fair." Relativism is the view that moral facts are relative to an individual standards or one's culture standards or whatever else it is you relativize them to. It's not the view that there are no moral facts. In fact, the view requires that there potentially be moral facts. I guess if everyone's dead, then maybe the view is hold that there's not technically any moral facts. But moral relativists almost always think that there are moral facts. The view is a cognitivist view that holds that moral claims are capable of being truth apt. And it's trivially easy in practice for many of those views to be true. So, William Lane Craig, if this, first of all, whoever this professor is that's giving an F to students is not qualified to be teaching metaethics because they have a basic misunderstanding. So that's not good. Like this is like a chemistry professor not knowing what hydrogen and oxygen are and like doesn't know that that's what makes up water. To make a mistake like this shows that one does not understand relativism. And so that teacher was not in a position to give that student an F. That doesn't make any sense. Second, even if we set aside that issue, there's no inconsistency between being a relativist and caring about fairness and being upset with the teacher for giving you a grade based on some standard that you don't think should be relevant to giving you that grade, any more than if you're a relativist and someone serves you food, like a relativist about food. I don't think there's an objective fact about whether my food is good or bad. If you serve me a bucket of garbage, I'm not going to go, and I object and I go, "This is disgusting." It's what? It's disgusting. But I thought as a gastronomic relativist, you don't think anything tastes good or bad. You see how ridiculous that is? Just because you don't think things taste objectively good or bad doesn't mean that you don't think that they taste good or bad. Likewise, just because you don't think things are objectively good or bad, in other words, stance independently good or bad, that doesn't mean that you think things aren't morally good or bad. That's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous view. So what we have here isn't just a bad objection and misreading of the commitments of relativism. We have a boneheaded one. This is ridiculous. And it reveals a profound misunderstanding of the position. And he's sitting here laughing and gloating, presenting this position. This is a professor of philosophy. Why is it that I'm sitting here having to correct professors of philosophy on basic metaethics. This is like, imagine I was playing a video and I had to explain what like a comma and a period was to about a freaking English professor. Do you realize how ridiculous that would be if that was the state of affairs that we were in? And yet that is the state of affairs that we appear to be in when it comes to the matter of metaethics. It looks like many critics of metaethics, specifically anti-realist views, cannot for the life of them frame those views accurately. It's profoundly frustrating. Very, very ridiculous. All right. Eve says Lance Bush, very popular in Australia, talked about constantly in philosophy classes. What's talked about constantly in philosophy classes? Annoyed Dave says, Lance, hurry up and write a book already so I can assign you to a Phil class. Are you teaching philosophy classes? I got a couple things you could assign, or I could recommend you assign. But yeah, I gotta get to writing a book. I gotta write some articles first. So I got my work cut out for me for the next few years. All right, so that one's not good. That's a fail from Craig. I guess we should finish it.
And all of a sudden, the student got the point. And at that point,
But what's the point? What is the point? He's not delivering the punchline here. What was the student getting wrong? I mean, this is silly.
the professor changed the back into the student. I think the student learned more through that experience than he did through writing the paper. I had a friend who was a philosopher.
Yeah, I mean, this story sounds apocryphal to me. I don't know if this actually happened. I'm not saying Craig is like making it up. Maybe someone told him this did happen, but it has that vibe of like an allegory. So I don't know if this happened or not. If it did, and I was a student, I would refuse to change anything, and I would go object somewhere because this is a very bad point. All right, let's have a look at this next one. That one I had listened to, but this one I haven't. So we'll see.
Ethical perspective. When you talk to these people,
Okay.
Joel would from a larger.
No, I don't want to do this one. All right, let's have a look at this one. Oh, I'm not sharing it. What am I doing? There it is.
Joel would have.
How do you decide what's right and what's wrong? And he said, by a consensus of the tribe. And I said, so it's subjective. And he said, yes, it's subjective. So I said, so you could have a different consensus for different groups depending on what they decided. And he said, yes. And then I asked him, so what if the consensus was types like you are dangerous, we're going to eliminate you? Are we able to do that? And he said, it depends. At one stage, he answered me, he said, absolutely. I said, so you do believe in absolutes then? What you've got to do.
Yeah, so you do believe in absolutes then? No. Just because somebody says absolutely, that does not mean that they believe in moral absolutes. If someone says, do you believe that? And you say absolutely, that's a way of expressing certainty or something like that. That's just a different sense of the meaning of the term absolute. So that's a silly response that he gave there.
Is show them the inconsistency of their position, because that.
Okay, what's the inconsistency? Well, maybe there is an inconsistency here because it sounds like maybe some horrible kind of agent relativism.
They have to borrow from a Christian worldview regardless.
How do I start a?
But what's the inconsistency? Borrowing from I mean, you would have to show that they actually are borrowing from a Christian worldview. But even if they were, there's not. What's the inconsistency?
Conversation about God's truth to someone who believes in moral relativism.
Steal their wallet.
Yeah, this is not clever. It's very similar to the case that we just heard with William Lane Craig. If you're a relativist, you act based on your own standards and values. So you could be against people stealing your wallet. This is not an issue. And let's say you're a cultural relativist and someone in your culture steals your wallet, and according to your culture, it's wrong to steal your wallet. What would be inappropriate about objecting? This idea that if you're a relativist, you can't object to people doing things you find objectionable is false and kind of ridiculous. And it's just, there's just this constant pattern of misunderstanding relativism. Look at the smirk and the smile. This is not funny. This is annoying ignorance.
Oh, that, by the way, I stole that.
I debated Bill Nye in 2014, but then in 2016, when we opened the Ark, he came through the Ark, and for 2 hours, I was able to challenge him all the way through. One of the things I said to him was, how do you decide what's right and what's wrong? And he said, by a consensus of the tribe. And I said, so it's subjective. And he said, yes, it's subjective. So
I think that started over again.
Joel would have.
How do you
Ugh, sorry,
decide?
that keeps happening. All right. And then we got one more. Maybe I'll have some more if I can dig them up. So you see, it's constant crap all over the place.
I will.
I'm
Do you
not trying to do that. Okay, let's see.
think that the ownership of other human beings under the conditions of the Hebrew Bible are immoral?
Yes.
So how do you account for God permitting something and giving you details about how to do something which is proactively immoral?
He's not permitting me, permitting my great 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 great
To do something
grandfather
immoral.
to do something
To do
that in
something
the time
immoral.
that in the time was not considered immoral.
It wasn't considered immoral,
Right.
but
Good job, Alex. It wasn't considered immoral. It doesn't matter if it wasn't considered immoral. The question is whether it is immoral or whether you consider it immoral.
was it immoral? Now,
And by today's standards, by today's standards
who's
that
the
were
moral
developed by the
relativist?
Judeo-Christian tradition, sure. By today's standards developed under the Judeo-Christian tradition, immoral.
Who's the moral relativist now? A moment ago, you say that the great success of religion is providing a sort of untouchable moral basis that sort of transcends human affairs and human debates. And now when I say, well, look at this, open your own religious scripture and look at this blatant immorality, you say, yeah, but well, that was considered to be fine at the time. It's considered to be bad now by the progress of Judeo-Christian
There's a question.
values. Who's the moral relativist?
Well-
Do you think that the
We don't have enough context there, but I think it's at least a rhetorically good point and probably more generally raises some significant concerns for Ben Shapiro's point. Not that I think Ben Shapiro is going to handle meta ethics super well. Cool. All right. Not really much of an objection there. I thought Alex did well in that particular exchange. So yeah, I mean, we could go through these. I have more of these saved somewhere that I'll have to get through at some point. But I'm not thinking of any particular realist videos that are short enough that I want to cover them. There's another Matt Walsh video I could cover. So I'm not really sure. Maybe it makes sense to wrap it up there. I think so. Just a quiet night. Yeah. Yeah, Hayden said that was a good gotcha from Alex. I agree. I think that was a good one. Alex does pretty well in these discussions. I try to be critical of him, but often I think he does pretty well. Jeremy says he caught Ben super speed talking like a time stopper catching the flash. Yeah, but to be fair, like sometimes I talk super fast. I'm not doing it now. All right. I think that's it for me. I think that's it. We'll continue with the humor stuff another time. And like I said, I have a blog post coming out where I'm going to have another look at it. All right, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm going to call it a night. See you all later. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment in the comments section, and I'll see you all another time.